My friends, what a disaster. We just witnessed a military debacle. The Ukrainian front around Avdiivka is actually collapsing. Russian army assault detachments broke through, and after smashing one Ukrainian position after another, they went straight for Ocheretyne. We're talking about a 6-kilometer push from the contact line. Here you can see Russian soldiers of the 433rd Regiment of the 47th Division celebrating their victory and raising the white-blue-red flag at the center of the settlement of Ocheretyne.
В ходе освобождения населенного пункта Очеретино над административным зданием восстоял российский флаг, российский триколор.
Now Russian detachments are mopping up the remaining Ukrainian strongholds in the village. I mean, take a look at that. Everything started on the 10th of April, and then hour by hour, day by day, the Russian bulge kept expanding. Late on the 22nd of April, pro-Ukrainian telegram channel Deep State UA reported, the situation in Ocheretyne worsens. No shit! Who would have thought? And do you want to know why this entire mess happened? Because the soldiers of the entire 115th Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade abandoned their combat positions.
Our men flee the battlefield!
That's right, one of the NATO-trained Ukrainian brigades got routed upon first contact with the enemy. Honestly, what a disaster. And according to the latest news, Novobakhmutivka has also fallen.
15-я штурмовая бригада вооруженных сил Российской Федерации взяли Новобахмутку.
Solovyovi might be next. And the worst is that this comes after a series of setbacks in the last few days. There was the Russian capture of Novomikhailivka on the 21st of April, where Marines of the 155th Brigade of the Pacific were geolocated on the western end of the village. Then there's the ongoing Battle of Krasnoorivka, where the Russian army captured the entire southern part of the town. I covered this in detail last video. If you're interested, the link is in the description. And if that wasn't enough, the ideologically motivated 67th Mechanized Brigade was disbanded for abandoning its combat positions near Chasiv Yar. Second time this happens in a week. Honestly,
Shameful display!
it's not looking good. The next 6 months are going to be extremely difficult for Ukraine. And this is just the beginning, especially since Russia is training 200,000 new recruits for the summer offensive. And remember what Ukraine's military spy chief Kirill Budanov said on the 30th of January. Russia's offensive is still ongoing. Somewhere in early spring it will be exhausted completely. The loss of Ocheretyne is extremely problematic. The village is located at a strategic position connecting all Ukrainian forces around Avdiivka. Since it was also a logistics hub, this is where most of the Ukrainian armored and artillery units were deployed, like this 155mm Crab self-propelled howitzer and this M1A1 Abrams. Now that the village is in Russian hands, the large number of buildings will turn the settlement into an ideal center for the concentration of Russian forces. And you want to know how the Russian army renamed the Avdiivka front? Now it's the Pokrovsk front. That's right, the Russians are now aiming straight for Pokrovsk. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Fun fact, we already talked about the vulnerabilities of the Ocheretyne sector in one of my previous videos. We can't believe the Russians want to take control of this area in between both train tracks. From this triangle, Russian forces could flank Berdishi and Stepove, or support the right flank of the encirclement with an attack towards Novokarinove and Keramik. But they could even push to Bakhmutivka for a strike on Ocheretyne. They could even combine some of these maneuvers for a simultaneous push against Ocheretyne, for example. In the weeks after the fall of Avdiivka, the Ukrainian army managed to hold the line along the Berdishi-Semenivka line, as their positions were supported by a multitude of small lakes. Russian and Ukrainian soldiers were battling in the mud for villages that were now ruins. The Ukrainian army even managed to inflict heavy losses on Russian armored columns in that sector. Despite these tactical victories for Ukraine, battle attrition had its effects on Ukrainian armored capabilities. For example, here you can see 3 destroyed M2A2 Bradley IFVs near Berdishi. The nightmare started in early April. By April 6, Russian assault detachments kept grinding their way forward. At the same time, the Russian command activated the Novokalinove sector, and by the 8th of April, Russian assault squads had advanced 1,000 meters. Now, in order to bypass the settlements of Berdishi and Semenivka, the Russian troops tried to outflank Ukrainian positions with a hook from the north. That's how a mechanized unit ended up pushing 700 meters forward. Here in this video, you can see the destruction of 2 armored vehicles by Ukrainian drones. Nonetheless, the Russian army secured the sector by the 10th of April, but nothing out of the ordinary. It's the next day that, yeah. I think it all started with a routine Russian infiltration mission by Storm Z detachments. Their job is to recon enemy positions and find weak points. I'm pretty sure that this recon mission faced little to no opposition. They called in reinforcements, the second wave mopped up enemy bastions and trenches, and then they moved on to the next line of defense, which again must have collapsed pretty quickly. That's when the 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade, из Samary в Sibiri, from Samara in Siberia, that participated in the storming of Avdiivka, and the 27th Motorized Rifle Brigade rushed into the opening. Now it became clear that there was a big gap to be exploited. The 115th Mechanized Brigade simply melted away the moment this massive attack force came into contact. Apparently, the Ukrainian commanders of the 115th Brigade decided to retreat before they got annihilated on the spot. Really, who can blame them? Low morale, low ammunition, low on manpower. Like I mentioned in my previous video, on paper there are hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers in every battalion. In reality, some of them only have 100 fighters available. It's very possible the 115th Mechanized Brigade only had 400 men to defend the entire sector, when suddenly, I don't know, 2, 3, 4,000 Russian soldiers showed up, plus their overwhelming firepower. Here in this video, you can see a Ukrainian soldier surrender to a Russian squad of infantry. Meanwhile, in this other footage, Russian troops surrounded a fire team of Ukrainians while clearing a trench line. All of them were captured. According to Spanish newspaper El País, the Russians took advantage of the communication problems that occurred between the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 25th Airborne Brigade. And that could explain how the men of the 115th Mechanized Brigade suddenly got exposed. In the end, the Siberian assault detachments of Group Center pushed 1,000 meters from this tree line up until the first houses of the Garden Society, nicknamed Esente Zarya District by the Russians. By the 13th of April, heavy fighting took place there, but the defenders were overwhelmed as more Russian forces poured in. By the 15th of April, the Esente Zarya district fell, and the enemy exploited its latest success with another 2-kilometer push. From what I've seen, the retreat was painful. Scattered groups of infantrymen trying to reach the rear on their own, some of them while evacuating their wounded comrades, while Russian drones showed them no pity. Now the command center of the armed forces of Ukraine was in full panic mode. The Russians were creating a wedge right in between the Ukrainian grouping in Novokalinove and the one centered on Novopokrovske. 5,000 to 8,000 Ukrainian soldiers would get isolated from one another. On top of that, Ocheretyne was the logistics hub for all the Ukrainian units in the sector. All the supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements came through that settlement. If the Russians knocked out the Ukrainian army from there, GG, well played. Meanwhile, in the rest of Ukraine, the blame game started. Who was guilty for this debacle? Here in this post, the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov discussed the failures of the 115th and 47th Mechanized Brigades in the Ocheretyne sector. In response to this Russian surprise attack, that same 47th Mechanized Brigade that had suffered heavy casualties in the summer and throughout the fall and winter in Avdiivka was on its way to be rotated out of the battlefield to refit. Nope! The 47th Mechanized Brigade was immediately turned around to plug the gap. At this rate, this is what the 47th Mechanized Brigade will look like in a couple weeks. All 2 soldiers of it! By the 16th of April, the Russians shoved their tip right into the front door of Ocheretyne after another 1,300 meter dash along the railway line. One benefit they probably had was the lack of fortifications and mines along this axis. Fighting was now taking place around the Ocheretyno-Tergavaya electric substation on the eastern side of the village. You know what? Ukrainian propaganda was so good that despite all these clear setbacks, they still made everyone believe the situation was under control.
Everybody stay calm! What's the procedure, everyone?
With videos like this one, where we see a Russian infantry squad getting shelled by very precise mortar fire. In reality, things went from bad to worse. These Russian riflemen were geolocated right outside of Ocheretyne, exiting this trench line they just captured. Behind them sits the electric substation that was still under Ukrainian control. As you can see in this footage, Ukrainian artillery struck the main building of that compound. And then we see over 20, no, 30, no, 40, 50 Russian soldiers run away, one by one, into these woods. Yay, Победа, victory for Ukraine! Not really. How did 50 Russian stormtroopers, a platoon at full strength, even manage to get there in the first place? And mind you, this is probably the biggest Russian unit I've seen at one spot throughout the entire war. So you can get an idea of how many 50-man platoons were actually rushing towards Ocheretyne. Throughout the 18th of April, heavy fighting took place around the electric substation. Pro-Ukrainian Deep State UA reported, "We wrote in the afternoon that the enemy was pushed back from the substation, but it became known that they climbed back up and are trying to hold out under the barrage of artillery of the defense forces." The Ukrainian command now had to extinguish 2 fires at the same time, because the same day, Russian assault units gained a foothold in Novokalinove after a 2.5 kilometer push across open terrain. As you can see on the map, the maneuver was straightforward. A double envelopment of Novokalinove both from the west and from the east. And as you know, for Ukraine now, the job is to never let the 2 tips touch. Otherwise, a number of Ukrainian soldiers could be trapped inside these villages and forced to lay down their weapons. The only thing preventing the Russians from achieving this are the sets of fortified trench networks west of the settlement of Keramik. Here's a bird's eye perspective of the settlement of Ocheretyne. It's surrounded by flat, open fields and cut in half in the middle by a railway line. If we zoom in, we see the electric substation where heavy fighting is taking place. And of course, in preparation of the final assault, the Russians fired everything they had available. You can even see on the satellite map how much shelling took place between the 14th and the 22nd of April. In the morning of April 19th, the Russians expanded their gains in Novokalinove with another 250-meter push. Meanwhile, Russian and Ukrainian infantrymen were battling in terrible house-to-house fighting on the outskirts of Ocheretyne. It was really one counterattack after another, but we can believe the Russian army's assault detachments benefited from a numerical advantage, plus the continuous artillery support, on top of airstrikes on any large building still standing in the village. This Ukrainian soldier complained that the Russian aviation was dropping one FAB bomb after another, and that nobody was there to clear up the rubble. Meanwhile, there were additional Russian thrusts towards Berdishi. According to reports, Ukrainian defenders there were pinned down in basements due to Saltsypyok artillery strikes. On the 20th of April, all hopes were crushed when a new rotation of Russian stormtroopers arrived. They now secured a 500 meter by 500 meter area on the eastern side of Ocheretyne. This was confirmed by the following geolocation of Ukrainian drones striking Russian riflemen right here, around these houses and along this trench line I just showed you earlier. If the debacle could not get worse, in the evening of the 20th of April, the first reports arrived of the withdrawal of the last Ukrainian forces in Semenivka due to the pressure northwest of Berdishi. Little side note, during World War II, low-key the Germans loved these Soviet breakthroughs. They would let the enemy push forward until they overextended their lines. Then they would gather an armored task force and counterattack right in the flanks and trap all these Soviet soldiers. In the afternoon of the 21st of April, the railway station of Ocheretyne fell into enemy hands, as Russian riflemen were spreading across the urban area. I'm sure the Reddit armored detachment will solve the situation. The Ukrainians needed a quick reaction force to knock the Russians out of the village. That's how scattered elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov were urgently redeployed. However, it was too little too late. For example, here on the 22nd of April, you can see the intervention of an M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle pushing from the western side of Ocheretyne. But notice how it is completely alone and without any type of infantry support. There's no way such an attack can turn the tide of the battle. Meanwhile, drone operators of the 47th Mechanized Brigade did harass Russian infantry, but they had no shock units available to regain the lost ground. Later that day, by 1 p.m., after a lot of back and forth, the train station was fully secured by the Russians. Fighting now reached the vicinity of the Altcom brick factory. The Ukrainians had effectively lost control of the southern half of the village. Here you can see Russian soldiers walking in front of the administration building located right at the center of the settlement. By 9 p.m., Russian infantry squads were pushing deeper and deeper into Ocheretyne, and only the northern part remained under relative Ukrainian control. On April 23rd, more Russian reinforcements were sent right into the breach, and their assault detachments stormed the village of Novobakhmutivka.
Мы, батальон специального назначения «Арбат» и 15-я бригада, 15-я штурмовая бригада Вооруженных сил Российской Федерации взяли Новобахмутку сегодня, 24 апреля 2024 года.
And the following day, on the 24th, they advanced 600 meters and got a foothold inside Solovyove. Further south, the Russian army crossed the Durna River and expanded its control inside Semenivka. It's very possible that in this sector the Ukrainians are fighting a rearguard battle, just to stall the Russian advance. From now on, if the Ukrainians fail to counterattack, and if the Russians fully secure Ocheretyne, I see three options. Option 1 for Russia would be to focus on the capture of Solovyove and turning Ukrainian positions along the Berdishi-Semenivka-Umanske line. If successful, this could lead to a chain reaction and cause the Ukrainians to retreat all the way up to Novopokrovsk. Number 2, after clearing Ocheretyne, the Russians could push towards Arkhangelsk in an attempt to encircle Ukrainian positions in Novokalinove and Keramik, all the while pinning down and providing direct support for their flanking operation on the eastern side. Option 3 would be riskier, in an attempt to really break through Ukrainian lines and force a major withdrawal, evacuation. The Russian army could continue their wild cavalry charge towards Solovyove, Sokil, and or Novo-Alexandrivka, but such an attack could make their flanks extremely vulnerable to counterattacks. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.